So welcome to Coaching Cocktails. And we're glad you're here to join us talking about doing Agile like we mean it. My name is Deborah Preuss. It looks funny, but it rhymes with rejoice. And I'm facilitating today. I'm your host, and Steve is our co-host. We like to work as a pair. Steve is going to be catching what falls through the cracks. And we invited Jean to talk to us because I also was involved at the tail end of her writing the book. She asked me to have a look at it and give her some comments, some feedback. And I was really delighted to discover a kindred spirit when it comes to Jean. I was really pleased that you're drawing attention to the being side of the work. And so we're really happy that you're here. And today, as I was preparing with Jean, something that was sort of between the words she was saying that jumped out at me is we don't have to wait to get old to get wise. And I thought that was kind of cool. So today, talking about presence, wisdom, and agile leadership. So we're going to be toasting during the call. Have you brought a drink, Henry?
No.
Would you like to get one? Glass of water, cup of coffee?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. And so our first toast, may wisdom come while we can still enjoy it. To wisdom.
So I am an Agile coach in Portland, Oregon, and I'm active in the Pacific Northwest. I have my family members here in the background. Frankie is a standard poodle, and Peter is a Desert Lynx Manx cat. And they will hopefully be both very quiet because they're both very tired. We had a bit of an interrupted night. Portland is a big and growing city. We have Agile PDX here, which is an Agile Alliance user group, and we're one of the most supposedly well-organized and active groups certainly in the US, and that keeps me pretty busy. I also have a background in traditional project management, and I tend to bounce back and forth between the perspectives, trying to draw the groups together for mutual advantage, as they each have something to bring to the conversation. So that's a little bit about me.
So sometimes we'll do breakouts at this point to let people get to know each other, kind of warm up a bit because you've just come from work or got out of your car, wherever you are. But today we're going to do things a little differently because Jean is talking about presence, and so we're going to fold the breakouts into Jean's talk. So at this point, Steve, I'll ask you to just pin the recording. That influences the way the recording gets made. And welcome, Jean, and tell you that I'm really happy that Jean is here because, well, I met her on a cocktail here. And then as it happened, we ended up in a breakout together. That was a kind of nice little piece of serendipity, and found out we had some common interests and said, oh, let's talk later. So then we got on a call later. And somehow at the end of your process of putting your book together, we were back in touch, and I was really happy to get a look at that in advance. And one of the things I love, I mean, there are a number of interesting facets about Jean's book, which is called The Preservation of the Heart of Agile, From Mindset to Consciousness. And one of the things that I love about it is this refocusing us on what I think might be the magic of Agile, which is the being part of Agile, inviting people into being in a maybe a fuller way, in a more satisfying way. So Jean, I will just pass this over to you, and
Sure.
When you're ready, then we'll take over for the breakout.
So just to illustrate an aspect of consciousness and consciousness shifting, I want to talk a little bit about something that we do in a code retreat that I facilitate or co-facilitate on a quarterly basis. There is a group here in town called PDX Women in Technology. It was founded a few years ago that is a group of now about 4,000 women. And a year ago, I noticed that we needed really more training in technical skills. And has anyone experienced the code retreat facilitation model? Maybe I should describe that a little bit. It's a self-organizing international group of software developers that are focused on improving software craftsmanship. And I care a lot about technical practices. So we got this going, and my partner had a PhD in computer science and was really aware of the risks of getting into your head when you're coding. So we start every retrospective now by doing mountain pose. Is anyone here a yoga practitioner? So let me just talk a little bit about what mountain pose is. And the first time I saw it in an Agile environment was several years ago when I was coaching a team where there was a tall, graceful, stately Chinese woman who wore these high-heeled boots, and she was like 6 feet tall with her boots on. And she would come in to stand up every day and assume a mountain pose position while we were doing our daily stand-up. And it certainly focused us all a little bit differently. So when you're doing mountain pose, this is the way I introduce it to the women in the code retreat, you are usually standing. We're going to be sitting, so you're going to have your feet shoulder width apart on the floor, even though you're sitting, for some alignment and groundedness. And you're going to think of your spine as a string of pearls that is suspended from the sky. You can feel that pulling you up a little bit. And you're going to think of your shoulders as 2 bicycle riders riding into work in the morning, side by side. They cross the bridge, and one waves and turns to the right, and the other waves and turns to the left. And so your chest is open, it's easy to breathe, and we're just going to take a moment to inhale and exhale. And then we begin our retrospective after each iteration in the stand-up. That's a crash course on mountain pose. Think what it would be like if you started your daily stand-up that way and how people would refocus. And this brings us into presence differently. So what I'm going to ask you at this point, and we can talk a little bit about what presencing is, and as I describe that, it'll help you maybe get some examples in mind of when you discovered you were not quite present with the group that you were coaching. Maybe you weren't feeling well that day. Maybe you had just gotten some shocking news you couldn't share with the team before you walked in to work with them. And you were sitting with them and suddenly realized you weren't there for them. Maybe you weren't even in your body because you were so distracted. And what was that moment like when you noticed you weren't present with them? I'm sure it's happened to all of us because coaches deal with difficult things all the time. Kudos to you if you have never been other than present with a team. And did they notice first or did you notice first? And I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to kind of tell you how I got to where I was when I started writing the book. Certainly, I've been doing this work, I've been doing Agile coaching for about 6 years, but I've been in IT for over 25 years now, and have seen, of course, a lot of changes. And I would not have used words like manifest or consciousness or presence even 6 years ago, even though I've had a number of experiences along the way. Early in my career, when I was busy buzzing around, because I've been an independent consultant most of my career, and I might carry a contract with US Bank and with Intel and with ADP all at the same time, buzzing them back and forth across the metro area, working on deliverables back when I was working on teams. And then more as I moved into coaching or project management, I was working more with one client at a time. But what I was noticing is a lot of my work had to do with other people's misfortune. I would come in after some sort of disaster. There had been a downsizing, or there had been some sort of situation where the project was out of control, people were in a lot of pain. And I began to notice, particularly after a downsizing, which is like ripping the body apart, that you could almost hear the whole system kind of moaning. And in really bad situations earlier on with downsizing, they didn't do anything to help the people heal from the survivor guilt and that sort of thing. You could almost see visually this, or symbolically, this blood flow across the floor as people would talk about, oh, I'm the only one left in my group, or whatever it was. And it was an interesting thing to make my living out of other people's misfortune. And then at one point, I was invited into the Agile movement because it seemed to me that we needed specific collaboration skills that we weren't having on these project teams. And I was making a presentation on a curriculum for collaboration for cross-functional teams at the Oregon Graduate Institute. And I got a call from someone who said, we heard about this presentation and we think that you are our people. So I went to meet those people. And they were some interesting people, and I discovered there was something called the Agile movement. And what really attracted me to it when I read the manifesto and principles was the social aspect of it and the extent to which this could help heal the situations that I was constantly walking into. As I moved into more coaching, I'd always noticed kind of poetic moments on teams or in projects, but as I moved more into coaching and found that Agile coaching often bridged into the personal, and we were talking a lot about mindset starting, 5 years ago or so, I could see the shift in mindset being important, but what I was noticing was that specifically, it first occurred to me when I was helping teams make space for technical practices, and I could see a shift as they improved their ability to use XP technical practices like pairing and refactoring and collective code ownership and that sort of thing. They would move together as a group, which was interesting. I mean, they would want to go to lunch together. They would move like a school of fish as the situation improved in their connectedness. And then I started hearing from people that I was coaching that it was affecting their lives at home. One woman decided to get a divorce as a result of learning about Kanban, the Agile Manifesto and Kanban. And that was pretty interesting. Then when I was working on my master's, which really focused on leadership theory, Agile project management, and system thinking, it occurred to me in 5 years, we're going to be talking about consciousness like we're talking about system thinking now. And it was just kind of coming together in my work as well as in my study. And I paired up with a technical practices coach to write an InfoQ article called Technical Practices as a Hack on Consciousness. And it's up there. You can read it on InfoQ. And we're giving examples and pulling on resources in the integral consciousness field, and got a lot of good feedback about that. As I looked at the teams that I was coaching more, I couldn't say many of the things that I was doing. I couldn't tell them that when I enter a system, I'm really functioning in a shamanic way, whole body listening, or as Otto Scharmer calls it, his theory U or presencing is very much about listening with the whole body, which is his shamanic practice, and going with the system as it changes. Then last spring, I came back to my home office after working with 3 teams in a startup that was under a lot of pain and stress, and realized I had several unfinished books around and I needed to sit down and finish one of them. And the more I focused on the writing, the more I found myself writing about how mindset was not sufficient in the Agile community. We really needed to look more at consciousness and the consciousness of the coaches, consultants, and Agile advocates in the system as well. As we facilitate a shift in a system, we are in the embodiment of that shift. And how we are in the system has a lot to do with whether the shift can occur. So the degree to which we stay present and are able to listen and be in dialogue has a lot to do with whether the shift will occur. I ended up delving more deeply into triple loop learning, which is something we don't really talk about, but it is a practice aligned with presencing. Presencing is a form of triple loop learning. And it became clear to me as I was talking to more and more coaches, and I started reaching out to people around the world who I'd find online, as well as interacting with people locally, became clear to me that coaches are often pushed to the edge of their endurance in their dedication to cause these shifts in organizations, and they end up manifesting behaviors that they might not if they were in their better selves. So it becomes incumbent on coaches to look at how they are and what the state of their consciousness is. And consciousness is a big term, so probably I should just take a moment and define what I'm talking about in terms of manifesting a different level of awareness, noticing, and understanding of self and other, which is why I talk about dialogue a lot, dialogue versus debate. And deep dialogue is very much a learning process. And it's going to challenge who you are if you really are in dialogue with another person or a system. And it's going to result in learning and change in you. Somehow I came across Ken Wilber in the consciousness hacking community. And he was talking with a groups of software developers through a web conference much like this, and it looked like they were even using Zoom. And there were guys in Palo Alto and Pittsburgh, and I can't remember if the other site was London or Bangalore, but he was really talking about this stuff, the same thing I was talking about. And we was talking about the personal responsibility as we engage with technology, and how our products and who we are relate, which was a strong indicator to me that not only was I on the right track, but I needed to speak up more. About 2 years before that, Jeff McKenna published Conscious Software Development, which is an excellent little book that everybody should read. It's very accessible. And I knew Jeff well enough to know that he was pulling a lot of punches in the book. And after I read it, I reached out to him and said, Jeff, you're pulling punches. And he said, yes, I know. And since he wasn't getting a more direct expression of the problem and solution, as it were, out there, that was what I was attempting to do. Trying to wake up Agile coaches, who are in some cases going to sleep because of the pressures they are in as they try to help help the systems they are in shift. I don't know if any of that resonates for anyone, but this might be a good moment to talk about those things. Does this resonate for anyone, or should I be more Pollyanna than I am? Are things really great out there in Agile world? We're seeing a great deal of success. Things are busting forward. Higher accountability, higher integrity, better throughput, reliable delivery. This is another good book, Consciousness Explained Better. It is short and it is very accessible. And I see that Steve is putting the links in, the Amazon links into the chat. I like books that have good bibliographies in them as a jumping off place for me, and this book has a great bibliography, as well as really talking about what consciousness is from the integral perspective. And let me just kind of talk about more the evolution of consciousness. I'm sorry, I'm not giving other people a chance to speak up here if this resonates with them or not. And we talk about the need to retrospect with teams, but we don't really talk about it with ourselves. And we talk about the need for teams to support each other and collaborate, and we're out there on our own in really bad situations a lot, one after another. Yeah. So people have been studying consciousness for millennia, and there are the more esoteric practices, for instance, like yoga and Buddhism, various forms of mindfulness meditation, which I find helpful. But it turns out there are philosophers and cosmologists and physicists and biologists, many people who've been working on this. And in the last 150 years, they have been documenting enough of their studies that they're able to resonate with each other and start forecasting into the future what higher levels of consciousness might look like. And the little book by Alan Combs, Consciousness Explained Better, gives you a good introduction to this. There has been a new form of consciousness emerging since about the time of the emergence of the personal computer, and that's integral consciousness, and it overlaps with perspectival consciousness, which has been the dominant consciousness that all of us have been raised in, and that these organizations we're working in have been created in. Their hierarchical systems, their bureaucratic systems come out of that kind of thinking. Also, their sense of organizations as machines has come out of that kind of thinking. It's very difficult to grasp the next level of consciousness. I'm going to read a quote to you from Combs to kind of try to give you a sense of what it's like. So he says that a mental perspectival understanding of snow would specify when it fell according to clock time. It snowed between 3 and 5 o'clock this morning. But an integral experience of the snow might emphasize that it is the night's snow, the gift of the night, or some other poetic expression emphasizing the quality of the experience of the night and the snow, rather than abstracting an event outside of experience that presumably occurred during a particular episode of clock time. And the difference between the two levels of consciousness, I've noticed, has a lot to do with time, appreciation of the human experience, and ability to welcome difference fluidly, which we're certainly grappling with in the culture and grappling with in organizations. As I've looked at the problem more and more, it seems to me that in larger bureaucratic systems, the challenge Agile has as it enters that environment is it is a different level of consciousness encountering. So it's more of the integral encountering the perspectival level of consciousness. And if we as Agile coaches don't attend to the consciousness that we walk within, it doesn't have that example to be inspired by or to propagate across the organization. I'm seeing some concerned faces. Is that making any sense at all?
Yes, and just thinking, frankly.
Yeah. So in the book that I published, The Preservation of the Agile Heart, there are a number of poems. And the reason for that is that some things can only be communicated poetically. There is a poem in there about a massive layoff that happened a couple of years ago, written from the perspective of the person who is laid off, that I have a hard time reading aloud myself. But when I read the poem to people who went through that in that organization, it seems to touch something in them that was not previously expressed, which is what poetry does. And something that we can do as Agile coaches is to notice those poetic moments and make use of them as teaching moments as well. I think one of the most difficult things about this shift in consciousness, and I've only been voicing this fairly recently, because it's fairly quick and fairly scary when you think about it. The shift in relationship to time puts people out of sync with the kind of organizations they were in. And when we think about Agile, we're constantly saying, you know, the timeline isn't the primary focus, but the organization is saying the timeline is the primary focus. And Agilists are less willing to sacrifice the quality of the human experience than the organization in which Agile is trying to emerge. But when I look at people, and there are people out there who are farther along in this, you can read their books, and in the right forums, you can talk with them. That different relationship of time seems to be a consistent theme. So quality of experience over time. This might also be a good time, Steve, to bring up the triple loop learning image.
Sure.
And I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with double loop learning because probably you're all doing retrospectives, but this is going to be a little bit of a review. So single loop learning is where we just have that experience and maybe there's a gap. We have a plan for a change. We're going to be able to fix that kind of gap next time, but not other similar kinds of gaps. The power of double loop learning is that we have this experience. We notice a gap. We consider the mental model in use and adjust that mental model. And then we can head off errors of that type in future. We have a plan for that, and we've adjusted our basic mental model. And in triple loop learning, and it seems to go faster than double loop learning, or appears it's harder and is intended to go faster. You're having an experience, you're getting the feedback, noticing the gap, and in the moment, reassessing your values, beliefs, and beingness, and adjusting those so that you have the more positive outcome the next time. So when you talk about adjusting your values, beliefs, and beingness, that's a pretty tricky thing to do. It challenges who we are, and depending on how we manifest that difference in values, beliefs, and beingness, some people who are in the perspectival space are going to wonder about integrity issues. And as we grow and tend to grow beyond the community that has nurtured us to that point, the community can begin to wonder what has happened to us and want us to change back, want us to stop questioning the social agreements before that said, for instance, we have 3 primary frameworks that we use in the Agile community, and those are the best frameworks, as opposed to, well, maybe there's something new we can do. Maybe we can use a pattern-based approach. Or as some people are talking about now, maybe we don't need backlogs, maybe we don't need estimates, maybe we don't need a heck of a lot of things. But I would say those people could value from talking about consciousness more, because when we're talking about consciousness and we're moving into deep dialogue, we're talking about those sub-perceptive signals, the sub-perceptive interactions among individuals that Agile, as we talk about it up to today, doesn't really acknowledge. It's still looking at the outside of things rather than the inside of what goes on with people. Are you still with me? So the book, it says on the back, it's an invitation to a conversation, and it really is. I am not an expert. I am not a cosmologist. I am not a psychologist. What I am is an interdisciplinarian who does a lot of reading and observing in context in my practice. And I am also the person who didn't push the start button on the timer. So Steve and Deb, let me know if I'm staying in time. So the fact is, my experiences may be very similar similar to yours, but I've just read a few more books. And those experiences and the fact that I have been a practicing poet my entire life and believe in the power of poetry to save people's lives literally, to the extent that I started an open mic here in Portland in the run-up to the election because it was the most empowering thing, political thing I could do for people. I've just read a little bit more, and I definitely need people to enter into the conversation about consciousness and the software development movement with regard to Agile, or maybe specifically consciousness in the Agile community. my deep fear is that what I see is the Agile movement becoming increasingly mechanistic and looking more and more like the organizations it is trying to transform, partially because the Agile advocates, coaches, and champions are products of those organizations and those systems. And they might have had some waking up experiences, and they're struggling to do something with that waking up. And part of that is a kind of growing up that may come as a result of their experience with Agile. But when they get close to the old drugs, it looks awful attractive. And you don't even know when you start re-engaging so often. I think a lot of the conversation around bias and the way the brain functions is valuable, but it's a stepping stone as well, because the brain is an organ in the body and the mind goes beyond the brain. And what I'm talking about here is a somatic embodied experience. So a first step in breaking free from that thinking may be definitely this kind of neuroscience stuff, but you can quickly run out of road there if you're not thinking about the mind and the body and how that's all related to what's all around you. What's in the room with you right now, and I don't know if we have time to talk about fields, but those of us who have been talking in this last hour or listening while I'm talking, we've formed a field like a team does. And Jeff Sutherland has a video where he talks about morphogenetic fields very, very briefly. But that's what coaches are really trying to do. They're trying to help establish a healthy field and teach the team how to maintain that field. So how they affect that field is really important, and it goes beyond neuroscience. So I wouldn't discourage a study of neuroscience, but I would hope one wouldn't get stuck there, because there's more. Yeah, there's more. In fact, people in this field start talking about the three brains. So there's the brain here, the brain at the heart, and the brain in the gut. There are a lot of neurosensors, nerves in all those spaces, and we feel into things at the different levels. But in our field right now, we're very much here focused on just the brain and logic. As you study these things, you start hearing terms like transrationalism. Transrationalism is pretty important and pretty interesting stuff, but it doesn't find much of a home in the average hierarchical bureaucratic organization these days. Deb, I'm wondering, I wonder, Deb, if maybe I should just cover a couple of concepts quickly and give an example.
Sure, that'll focus us, and then maybe something will come up for people and they can put their things into the chat as we go. Okay.
So consciousness is a big word, and many people in many deep fields like cosmology and physics and theology and psychology all study consciousness. But for the purposes of the discussions that I tend to have, I'm defining consciousness as a nature of awareness, noticing, and understanding of self and other that is very dependent on deep dialogue, okay? And we had talked earlier about how people have been studying consciousness and documenting their studies long enough now that we can look at levels of consciousness and forecast about how humans will evolve in terms of consciousness into the future, and actually intentionally evolve, which is what I'm saying. Agile is an example of an intentional consciousness evolution, which is one of the reasons it's having a little trouble in the current perspectival consciousness as opposed to the kind of integral consciousness we've been moving into since about the emergence of the personal computer. I had read an example earlier from Alan Coombs about the difference between the time-focused aspect of perspectival consciousness and the poetic experiential aspect of integral consciousness. But at this one, I think I'm just going to read you a poem to try to get you right into that space. And this is a poem that's not in the book. It's about a woman who was very influential in my field, the field I was in 20 years ago. And it applies to us because Agile coaches and consultants and advocates, we often enter a space in a heroic fashion, either intentionally or we are put in that heroic space. And this is about a woman who was a hero in her time. And the title of the poem is Mary Myrna Moira Margot. Whatever her name was, she was famous among us at the time. That day, she flew over the surface of the Columbia River on the back of her husband's sailboat. And he loved her, they said. She stood on the back of her husband's sailboat in a cardigan and no life vest until she was gone. No one noticed. No one looked back just when she slipped off and went under. We stared at each other with shocked tears when we were told. Some cried, shocked tears then. But today, no trace, and not for a long time now, of whatever her name was. So at the time, she was a hero and influenced us all, and we often enter as heroes. But how long is it after you exit an environment before they've forgotten your name and whatever influence you've left is attributed to whatever, and you can only hope that you've had enough influence, that the influence is more important than who did it, which I think is one of the hardest things for Agilists to grapple with. So we might have talked about Margot as so many feet and inches tall based on her resume and her lifespan. That's not what is important in the context of the consciousness we're emerging into. So where do we want to go with questions?
I so appreciate this community, and I really thank you for showing up here and being vulnerable to explore something that's kind of hard to grasp, but so important. Thank you for being here. And at this point, we would say goodbye, and instead I will say, stay and have a glass of wine with me, because I'm going to stay online if anybody wants to chat more about this. And those of you who need to go somewhere else, we'll honor the time box and say, we're glad you were here and farewell.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a final toast for the people that we're saying farewell to?
I do, and it's inspired by Eckhart Tolle. So if you've got a drink, and if not, you'll have to imagine that we're toasting to bringing the gift of presence into whatever we do. Let's do it.
Here, here.